They definitely don't make them like they used to, but buying an old home in Victoria, BC can be pretty intimidating. One of the things I love about our city is the mix of architectural styles, from grand manor homes to quaint summer cottages. Some of the homes that line some of our more established streets make it really special and charming. But should you buy one of them? Look, I get it. I'm a romantic too. My house is 110 years old, and although it isn't always the most practical, an old home can be very, very special. But there are horror stories, trapdoors, and things to avoid when buying an older home to make sure it doesn't end up being a money pit. Which is exactly why we're here today. I'm going to take you through the different eras of residential construction in our city and show you what to avoid if you're dead set on falling in love with an old home. Let's start off talking about some of the oldest homes in Victoria. Many of you that have been following along know that the oldest home in Victoria actually dates all the way back to 1850, but really the category that I'm talking about are homes built prior to 1920. There was a boom in residential real estate development from the turn of the century until about 1914, and many of our more established neighborhoods, like right here in James Bay, over in Fernwood, Rockland, and Fairfield, are lined with these beautiful, charming examples. You have a variety of styles that come in all kinds of shapes, sizes, and forms, but really these home types are classified in the arts and crafts or Victorian style of architecture. You have Queen Anne, Italianate, Tudor Revival that was part of the arts and crafts movement from famed architects like Samuel McClure, as well as beautiful craftsman bungalows that are more prevalent in parts of Fairfield. So what are the issues with these kinds of homes and what kind of things should you look out for? The first issue that I'll highlight is relevant for all the homes we'll talk about today, but it's more likely to be an issue the older the home gets. So let's talk about it right now. That's the structure and foundation of an old home. In this vintage, you typically do see poured concrete foundations, but because of the age, you can see significant cracks and settlement that could be ongoing and could also be a major budget expense. So get a clear sense of the structural integrity of the building first. You may also see dirt basements, no vapor barrier, no slab, which can be prone to water problems as well as rodent activity. Going off the foundation piece, perimeter drainage is something that's definitely lacking in this vintage if it hasn't been updated in recent years. These homes historically didn't have any perimeter drainage, and there may be partial updates over the years. That means when it rains inside too. Other issues on the outside of the building can include things like deterioration of the exterior envelope, because typically you would have wood siding and shingles that over time, if they're not kept up or replaced, are prone to water ingress and rot. Chimneys also are a deteriorating item in this vintage. I see a lot of homes without rain caps that allow water ingress to get inside the home and deteriorate the mortar at the base of the chimney, as well as allow things like birds to get into the chimney and start nesting. Going inside, you start to see bad electrical systems and knob and tube wiring that was used all the way up until about 1940. This is both an insurance risk and a fire risk. If the plumbing components are original, you may start seeing failures if you haven't already and they haven't been updated or replaced. You'll see copper, steel, and even brass in the supply components. And the waste sewer is typically cast iron in this vintage that has about a 100-year life and starts to rust from the inside out. So get a look at the plumbing components and see what needs to be updated. Fortunately, some of these homes up until about 1910 did not have any asbestos products. The downside of this is that over the years, updates and modifications made typically did contain them. So just because a home is from this vintage doesn't mean there isn't asbestos in there. I see it more commonly in things like vermiculite insulation, as well as asbestos wrap around some of the radiant hot water systems. And lastly, windows and walls. Single pane windows, failing trim around them, uneven wall insulation if any, typically lath and plaster and very little insulation, which means you're going to lose a lot of heat in the winter if there hasn't been anything blown into the walls over the years. You'll also see plaster finish starting to fail, which is more of an aesthetic thing, but all kinds of cracks all the way through your house is not the most pleasant thing. The grandeur and beauty of Victorian era homes isn't all roses, but if you can find one that's been updated and maintained over the years, it's a lot less work than you might imagine. Next up on our list, we have homes like this, built between 1920 to 1940. I think about these homes popping up again in a lot of our more established neighborhoods, like here in South Oak Bay, other parts of Oak Bay like Estevan, and also over in places like the Gorge community, as well as closer to town in the city of Victoria in Fairfield, Hillside, Fernwood, and Oaklands. These homes characteristically are a little bit smaller and more quaint than our larger, more grand arts and crafts examples from the 1920s and earlier. but they come with a lot of the same issues. Lack of or no insulation in walls in some cases, lack of perimeter drains or outdated clay tile systems, as well as knob and tube wiring that was used all the way up until about 1940. The one thing that I didn't include in our first section was about buried oil tanks. I didn't want to scare you right off the bat with a whole laundry list of things to avoid, but buried oil tanks basically are a hazard of buying anything built prior to 1960. Oil as a fuel source for forced air heating became more prevalent in this vintage, and someone had the bright idea of putting these storage tanks below ground instead of the ugliness when they were standing above ground. The consequence of that, unfortunately, is that you have a lot of these homes with buried tanks that have deteriorated over time and could cause potential leaks or contamination in the subsurface. So when you're buying any home built prior to 1960, make sure that you have an underground oil storage tank scan done to identify whether there's a tank present. You can also check for records at the local fire hall that may have either rendered it inert or pulled it out in the past. But even if they've pulled the tank out in the past, that doesn't mean there isn't one now, as there have been cases where multiple underground tanks have been discovered on one property. If there's contamination present, these can be a six-figure bill, but in the best case, where there's no leaks and no contamination, it's going to cost you between $3,000 to $6,000 to dig that tank out. Asbestos products are once again a concern in this vintage, and they can become more apparent when you have things like tape and felt around vents for forced air systems, as well as glued down flooring. And just like in our first segment, you have cast iron, waste sewer lines, copper plumbing supply, as well as clay tile from the house to the street that can cause issues over time, and it would be best to see plastic. So bring a checklist with you and make sure you go through and verify whether any of these issues exist to find yourself in one of these beautiful character homes in one of our more established areas. Hopefully I haven't scared you off by now. Let's jump to the next vintage of homes. Which brings us to our widest time category for today's video. These are homes built between 1940 all the way up until the late 1960s, but primarily what we're talking about here are those thick, squatty houses that came with the post-war residential construction boom. These homes were simple in form, easy to build, and are very functional even in their present form. They dot many of the neighborhoods in Victoria, but I have some specific examples of places where you can go pretty much a whole block and see the same style of house, like right here in Sax Point, also over towards Mount Ptolemy and Camosun College, as well as along the Lansdowne slope, where 50s bungalows are the common theme. Once again, look out for aging plumbing components and perimeter drainage that was historically clay tile in this vintage, and check for those buried oil tanks all the way up until 1960. Unfortunately, we're now entering a period that marked the peak of asbestos use in Canada between the 50s to the 80s. It was used because of its insulation properties, fire resistance, and durability, and started finding its way into more standard building products like drywall, ceiling texture, wall tape, and mud compound. So it's more common to find it if you're planning to open up walls in this vintage of home. You'll also continue to find it in flooring products and adhesives from this vintage. What we're talking about is actually a common misconception in Canada. All asbestos products weren't actually banned until 2018, but non-friable asbestos products, those that are found in things like sprayable acoustics and drywall compound, were banned in 1986 after a lot of lawsuits that came forward and sparked all of this health controversy. The other thing to bear in mind is that we're also entering the vintage where there is some overlap with the next segment of aluminum wiring that was in place from 1966 until about 1975. Aluminum wiring expands more than copper wire and is another fire and insurance hazard. So be sure to check out the electrical wiring to ensure your home is safe as well as insurable. Let's keep it moving to the next segment. The next residential construction boom was in the 70s, and this category is between 1970 all the way up into the late 80s, with some of the most iconic home types that you'll see in some of Victoria's more mature neighborhoods, although a little bit further flung from the downtown core, like right here in Gordon Head and other parts of Saanich, like over in Broadmead, as well as all the way out towards Esquimalt and even Langford. 70s homes come in all kinds of different shapes, sizes, and forms, but there are some really iconic designs that were birthed in this vintage, like the BC box. If you can picture it, you walk in the front door, you have steps up to the main, as well as steps down into the basement. That was great bonus space and is now really functional to offer suite potential to people that want to live on the main floor and have a mortgage helper downstairs. You also have really cool architectural styles through neighborhoods like Broadmead with these West Coast modern designs, lots of vault, skylight, and interesting angles, as well as lovely post and beam homes on the main level that again offer a little bit of vault, but also the functionality of having 2 stories. Now the downside of some of these homes once again coincides with some of the things we've touched on previously. You have a slightly different style of perimeter drainage. Usually you'd see concrete tile through this vintage, but by now that concrete system is pretty likely to cracks, breaks, and a breakdown of function. A lot of those post and beam styles also came with flatter roofs and torch-on membranes, which are less common in Victoria. And some of these homes also feature a lack of exterior gutters. So you have a hidden gutter and an additional torch-on membrane that's that much more expensive to replace. And the fact that you have a hidden gutter in behind the wall assembly can lead to water issues. One of those other overlaps, aluminum wiring, ran all the way up until about 1975. So make sure that your home has either been pigtailed or converted fully to copper wiring for insurability and safety. There's also a mixture of building envelope products that were used in this vintage. Most commonly, you'll see wood siding or stucco, but it seems to me like a lot of the stucco from this vintage actually hasn't fared as well as that from the previous vintage. I don't know exactly why that is, but I see it a lot that some of the stucco by now is breaking down, as is the wood siding if you don't really keep up on paint and maintenance. It's also more common to see pretty basic electrical heat sources through this era of construction, which was cheaper to install, but also poses less hazmat risks. Although once again, we're faced with some of those same asbestos problems all the way up until basically 1990, where you're more than likely gonna find it in some of the components like the drywall, mud, and tape. If I haven't scared you off by now, that's good because you've got a wide array of options. But if I have, just stick around because our last 2 segments get a little bit safer and more approachable. Now, before I forget, I should mention that prior to 1973, local governments adopted a building code under their bylaws, but since then, the provincial government has actually had authority to dictate the building code, and through the 70s, they adopted the National Building Code, and into the 80s and through current, they've added and revised the BC Building Code. As more rules and regulations have been added to the code over time, it has increased the costs, but with improved standards come greener, more efficient, and safer homes that avoid some of the pitfalls that we touch on today. Our second to last category is homes built from 1990 into the early 2000s. Now there are boundaries that I've established with this video, but there is a little bit of overlap between them. So there may be some homes built in 1989 or 1988 thrown into this mix. But generally what I'm speaking to in this vintage are 2-story homes. We saw a lot of slab on grade, and you can find a lot of these examples through parts of Saanich, like High Quadra, Sunnymead, Broadmead, over towards Royal Oak, as well as out in Langford in the Thetis Heights area, and all throughout View Royal. Sometimes I refer to these homes as lima beans. They're not the most attractive, and they can actually look quite dated in present form, and even more dated than some of those homes that were built in the 60s and 70s. But all the same, they're very functional, livable, and have generous room proportions. One of the main hang-ups with this category is polybutylene supply plumbing, also known as Poly B. This was in peak use between 1985 to 1997 and was actually taken out of the viable materials in the plumbing code in the mid-2000s. Basically, the issue here was leaks. And if you have Poly B in your home, you want to ensure that at the very minimum, it has copper fittings because of the joints. This plastic is prone to failure over time and can cause leaks. It's also a big insurance risk and can jack up your premium significantly. Another relic from this vintage is T-lock roofing shingles that discontinued production in the early 2000s. If they're still on a roof today, they gotta go. The last category to touch on today are homes built since 2006, coming all the way up to present. Really, these are modern contemporary homes. And the reason that I isolated 2006 is because there was significant update to the BC Building Code that happened that year. It was the insertion of a capillary break or rain screen. Many of you that are familiar with this in leaky condos, this happened in Vancouver and was a significant issue. It also affected other parts of the province, including Victoria, and there are leaky condos or issues with building envelope here as a consequence of lack of rain screen technology. Basically what it does is it allows the exterior cladding to be breached by water and still allows that water to escape behind it, where face seal does not. Homes in this vintage can provide some peace of mind because of the newer building standards, and they avoid some of those hazardous materials issues that we touched on earlier in the video. But they're not all perfect, so don't overlook an inspection just because a home is new. Houses and castles come in all kinds of shapes and sizes in Greater Victoria, but ultimately with a vigilant approach, you can avoid many of the hazards that go along with purchasing a home in our city, irrespective of the vintage, whether you're looking for the peace of mind of newer construction or the warmth and elegance of a character home, there's always things to avoid and look out for. If you're interested in more information on our real estate market or you're planning a potential move, feel free to reach out to me. My information is in the description down below, and make sure you subscribe for more great content on our beautiful city. I'll see you next time.